Good evening, Masal Khair. It's a pleasure to be here again in this joint activity. As Mandy mentioned, I'm here not really as a co-sponsor, but I'm here because of my interest in work of Mick and to say a few things to introduce that work. But also, we're very happy at the Khalidi Library to be teaming up with these great partners. We have some common interests, and where we have common interests, we should continue to work together. It's good for us, it's good for you, it's good for Jerusalem. So, we sometimes do things on our own, sometimes things on our books in Arabic, etc. But we're all really trying to fill the same vacuum or gaps together. So really, your turnout tonight is great. And I must say, this is the first time I would say an activity in Jerusalem of this sort is better attended than Ramallah, because everybody's in the cafes in Ramallah. Mick does not need any introduction in terms of all of the work he's done on Jerusalem. His obviously, as a professor in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, we are lucky that there is a generation of young people learning from him all that he has learned over the years. He's written extensively, published extensively on Jerusalem and on issues that concern us all, al-Awqaf in particular. He's one of the renowned experts for many years. What I think is most important about Mick, his work and his approach, and we often have a chance to correspond about this, that, or the other report, ICG, and so on and so forth, and we always agree, even though we just start out by disagreeing, but we always agree that there's something we can agree on. I think what's important about his work, and Amandi very much wanted me or somebody from the co-partners to be on the podium and be a co-lecturer, and we said no, we want to listen to Mick, so I'm not going to bore you too much, but she also wanted a Palestinian partner to talk a bit, and I'm glad you thought of that. So what I'd like to say as the Palestinian sort of participant in this evening's discussion is not so much to address the issues of rights, rituals, and contestation in the holy city of Jerusalem. What interests me is the fact that somebody like Mick, many of you, most of you are not Palestinian. So, over 100 years, this issue has been studied and restudied and studied and restudied and studied and restudied in each generation by a different set of scholars and a different approach. And, originally it was all part of a colonial, the scholarly work in the first half of this last century was part of a colonial enterprise to a great extent. Even the Israeli scholarship on Palestinians for the bulk of the last 60 years has been part of that same sort of mindset. So there are various issues about who is saying what and why they're saying it. And I think Mick's work is free from any doubt or ghubar, as we say. He's coming from all of the right angles as far as I'm concerned. Now, when I talk about the right angles, let me tell you what is important to me as a scholar in the way that we all work on these subjects. And I've been involved in certain donor sort of supported efforts on Jerusalem. I've been involved in Palestinian efforts on Jerusalem. And these comments are not really directed to international scholars, but it's to all of us. And I was recently asked to introduce a special issue of the Journal of Palestine Studies on Palestinian development, which is the first time the Journal of Palestine Studies hosts a special issue devoted to that. That reflects how important Palestinian studies has become. Even we have now a branch, a discipline. They teach masters in SOAS on Palestinian studies. So also within that, there's something called Palestinian development studies. And this has a long history. I won't go into that. You can read the introduction. The point is, this special issue has 4 articles by 4 young Palestinian, in this case, authors, recent graduates, recent doctorates. None of their work has been published except in bits and pieces, about different aspects of Palestinian development. And what I noticed and what I tried to do in commenting and introducing their work was to focus on the 4 things that they share in common. And I think that to a great extent, we can thank Mick for being part of this tradition. Even though I'm talking about a younger generation than myself or Mick of scholars, a more critical one that has come to become very doubtful of what the World Bank told the Palestinians for the last 20 years they should do, etc. And it's a very theoretically engaged as well group of scholars. And I'm talking about a large group of people of whom these 4 that I've whose work I introduce, are only some of the best examples. And there are 4 themes, let's say, that I think they have brought to the fore and that we need to think about when we're talking about Jerusalem. The first one is that we cannot forget that all of this is about settler colonialism. Those of us in the development world for the last 20 years who have tried to talk about markets and institutions and macroeconomy and GDP and governance, we were wrong. This is first and foremost about settler colonialism, so you need to know how do you deal with settler colonialism. How has it been dealt with? How does theory address it? And how does academia, instead of sitting in our ivory towers, how do we engage with doing something about settler colonialism? And I think, though Mick is not an activist in this sense, I think his work has always been very clear and unequivocal on these matters. The second issue, which is very important in the development studies, but it goes beyond development into governance and values and social structure, is those of you who have perhaps more or less heard of the word neoliberalism. So anybody today in Palestine doing social studies, social sciences, from a critical point of view, the first thing they'll start going on about is neoliberalism. And there's a lot of good things about the critique of neoliberalism, and one can argue about how much it needs to be, brought to the fore. But the point is that this is also coming in to these critiques and to these studies of social and economic and infrastructure and governance issues in the development context in Palestine, and that is a good thing because, again, the last 20 years has been mortgaged to this idea that perhaps there was a solution out there that didn't involve dealing with settler colonialism and didn't involve changing the way the governance of the economy is managed. Third thing is that this is also a tradition that is very careful about theory, and hence you will of course have heard of the most recent interesting ideas about Jerusalem, which is contested city. So there's this whole literature and geography of contested cities, and in fact we should look at it and we should think about our predicament in those terms. And I read also this other concept of a neo-apartheid city. So again, I won't go into those, but what I'm trying to say is that the work of Mick and the work of this group of scholars has married very well the theory and the material. So the work is not divorced from politics, it's part of politics, it reflects politics, and it intends to engage in the politics of Jerusalem. So work that does not do that, and that looks at some rosy future, or that pretends that we can somehow work it out otherwise, I think is suspect. And the final area of newness in the work that I'm referring to, and that perhaps, you don't have to be a Palestinian to write like a Palestinian or to see like a Palestinian. And I think one of the issues that these scholars have brought to the fore also is that we have been too much subjects of somebody else's research. And that permeates the nature of a lot of the research, especially from the Zionist political economists, especially from some of the international observers, be they scholars. So agency, the Palestinians being clearly, through the work that we do, speaking what is their problem, what is their need, what are their aspirations, is something that I think, again, Mick has always respected highly. So, just to conclude my introduction, and to just emphasize the issue of agency. We forget, Jerusalem, those of you, Abu Ghalib is here, and many of you are working on a daily basis in the many problems there are in Jerusalem. We feel sometimes hopeless. We just see it getting worse and worse and worse. But because of the work that I've had the chance to do as a custodian of the Khalidi Library, we've come across papers, family papers recently, some various periods, very interesting periods in Palestinian history. And what this highlighted to me, some of these things that we found, is how powerful we have been. I'm not talking about necessarily about Ruh al-Khalidi and Hussein Fakhri, who are the two sources of these papers, but it was clear that in 1909, in 1920, in 1947, our people, our leaders, our elites, our intellectuals, they were there, they knew what was going on, they were talking, and there was no secret about the problems with the Arabs, the problems with the leadership, the problems with... And there's a document from 1920. I don't know, those of you, I've sent it to Shireen Saikali, a historian, a Palestinian economic historian. She hadn't seen it. And it's called, it's 1920, it's published by the Palestinian Anti-Zionist Society. And it's called the Reconstruction of Palestine. And it is what Yusuf Sayyid did in 1990 and what the World Bank did in 2000 in terms of, this is agriculture, this is industry, this is construction, this is what we need to do. This is, remember, before the Zionist project had really taken off in Palestine. In 1947, I found a 2-page report by the head of the economic department of the Arab Higher Committee, addressed to the Naib, the number 2 of the Higher Committee, which is a report about the effectiveness of the Palestinian boycott campaigns, committees in Jaffa and in Jerusalem. And it's a very interesting thing because he has very good details, but basically he says Jaffa is going fine, they spend their money properly, they've got it all organized, it's effective. And then a page and a half about the problems of the Jerusalem Committee. I won't go into them. This is, not necessarily the subject here. The point is that we have always had institutions. We have always had thinkers. We have always had political aspirations and vision. And to be honest, I don't know why we're not doing something about it today and why it is that our performance as Palestinians and on Jerusalem and as Jerusalemites on Jerusalem has been so poor. But we have friends like Mick and Mandy to help us discuss these things more widely. Mick Dumper, I'm sorry to have taken so much time.
Thanks,
معلش. تقديم بس. Can we turn this on?
Okay, good evening. Can you hear me from this? Is it working? Good. I thank you, Mandy and Raja, for the introduction, and also to thank the sponsors of the evening. It's really a great pleasure to me. I have to admit, when I look in the front row and I see the director of Qasir, the governor of Jerusalem, and the director of the Islamic Archaeology Department on the front row, I'm a little bit intimidated.
Be careful.
I am a so-called expert of Jerusalem, but I don't live here, and I do not know the city a tiny bit as much as these people do know the city, and I feel a little bit anxious that I'm going to be seen as a cheeky little boy who is telling more experienced people what is going on. So please forgive me. If I'd known you were in the front seat, I would have rewritten my talk and done something else. But as it is, you will have to listen to what I have to say. As somebody who's no longer a resident, I did live here for many times during the 80s and 90s, but as somebody now who is a non-resident, I do, however, bring with me the perspective of an outsider who can see from afar some of the things that you may not be able to see. Closer, right, sorry. So I may be able to bring from afar some of the things you're not able to see because you are living it every day, and every day is another crisis, another problem. But I have the advantage of standing back further away and to be able to have a distant view, and also having worked in Jerusalem now since the early 80s, I can see some of the changes and patterns that have occurred in the city over that time. So I hope I can bring some of that extra expertise, which is of a different nature, to the discussion. What I want to talk about, I will divide in 4 parts. First, I want to look at what was the crisis that was occurring on the Haram Sharif earlier last year. And then I want to say, well, what has changed since that heightened crisis, where we thought we were at the edge of very serious developments. And then I want to analyse that crisis, the change, what happened earlier last year and what is happening now, and then perhaps at the end, when it's time to look a little bit into the future, what lessons can we learn from the last few years. Some of what I'm going to say may be familiar to you. I just want to summarise the early part. But the period I want to just look at to begin with is the period from 2010 to late 2015. And here, this is a period where, as many of you will know, is characterised by a very active settler movement taking over properties in the old city and in the periphery of the old city. Al-Arabi, this is not particularly new for you. But this was matched by a change in the discourse amongst the Israeli settler groups, a discourse which eroded the rabbinate prohibition of praying on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. This discourse and the activities of the settlers started to march together and become quite a big shift in the Israeli politics. And so we began to see increasing visits by Jews attempting to pray, increasing tunneling, trying to find alternative ways, the development of, say, for example, the prayer room in the al-Mahkamah, which is close to the Haram al-Sharif. And while this was happening on the Israeli side of things, the Palestinian side was often perceived as very weak. There seemed to be less influence over the al-Qaf administration and what they were able to achieve. The Palestinian Authority and PLO were excluded from Jerusalem and the Old City, found it very hard to be influential, to have any leverage in the area. Palestinian Authority itself was seen as weak, and having the divisions in the Palestinian camp didn't give it a platform from which it could demand Israelis to stop. To some extent, the Islamic movement inside Israel sought to replace the influence or the leadership, and we saw the volunteers associated with Sheikh Ra'id Salah becoming very active and providing some form of leadership. Now, in this period, as increasing numbers of Jews came to pray, it wasn't just that the prayers were occurring, it was the behaviour was changing, the access times were changing. There was more different types of Jews coming to pray. It wasn't just the extreme radical right, it was a broader range of them. And the Al-Qaf seemed powerless to stop it. There didn't seem to be, a drift into accepting a new situation, that the status quo was being eroded. And in all this, the Israeli police seemed complicit, seemed to be allowing this to happen, when in the past there were a little bit more control over what was happening. Obviously, the Palestinians, despite perhaps the lack of directed leadership, Palestinians did resist, increasing their presence in the Haram al-Sharif courtyard, mobilizing Islamification of the kind of resistance was what people often talked about. You saw the emergence of the prayer circles, the Murabitun and Murabitat, which were spontaneous attempts to restrain this increasing presence of Jews trying to pray on the Haram al-Sharif. Some of this activity was supported externally, possibly people say from the Islamic movement. The figures I hear that people got their transport paid and maybe got 1,500 shekels a month. It wasn't very much really, but it was a way of encouraging this. But it's very clear that this was not the only source of support, and much of the impetus for this kind of activity was also located inside the city itself. I also became aware in this period how the resistance was sort of changing in gender. There was much more active female resistance, and the activities of the Murabitat have drawn a lot of attention, made huge difficulties for the police. Sorry, you can't hear me. Just do put your hand up when I go soft. You had images of police physically ejecting women from the Haram al-Sharif, ripping the veils off, the humiliation in front of their friends and family, which in turn created indignation and a reaction by other members of society against this sort of attack on the honour of the Palestinians. And we must remember some of the female activists were very, very strong and intimidating. I heard a story that Yehudi Glick, who's one of the more outspoken participants of the Jews trying to pray on the Haram Sharif, he said when they put their face right up to your face and they shout at you, and you feel the spit on your face as they're shouting at you, it's very frightening. And that's Glick, okay? So, there's actually quite a physical and strong presence there. In all this period, the big fear, though, was the gradual Hebronization of Jerusalem, Hebronization of the Haram Sharif. And what do I mean by that? It's a word that is starting to be used more often. And what I mean by that is there's an incremental assertion of Israeli control, led by the radical groups, but who act as like the outriders, the scouts for the Israeli state to come in afterwards. And so provocative acts by these settlers, these radical groups, lead to an injection of Israeli security, which leads to greater Israeli presence, which then encourages the radical groups to come in larger numbers. So there's a circle which they kick off by drawing in the Israeli security services. So there's a process there, and many people felt this was beginning to happen in the Haram Sharif. In Hebron, we saw how over a period of many years, there's now a division in the Ibrahimi Mosque over times and space. It's not just, it's like a complete reversal of what happened in 1960, what was the case in 1967. In 1967, it was a Muslim mosque to which Jews were allowed to pray on certain times. It's almost a complete reversal now, where Muslims have access at certain times. And the big fear was this may be what was going to happen in the Haram Sharif through this process of Hebronization. Now, it hasn't got to that stage. What's the outcomes? The outcome in Hebron isn't what is happening in the Haram Sharif yet, but the process has started. And we don't know whether it's going to finish yet. Certainly until October and November last year, there was this very strong sense that this was where we were going. So what happened then in the end of last year and it's happening now? There seems to be a change. I call this a period of limbo because I don't really know what else to call it. Is it a transition to what is known as the status quo ante, to the situation that was before the arrival of Jews in large numbers to pray? Are we going back to that phase? Or is it what we call the lull before the storm? The storm is about to break onto us, there's a period of quiet just beforehand. Which one is it? And I'm not sure if I can say, but I will try and explore some of those themes. Certainly, the marking point was Kerry's meeting with Abdullah, and then later Kerry's meeting with Netanyahu. And there was certainly a shift after that point. And there seemed to be some re-establishment of the status quo. But let's unpack what came out of that meeting. I don't know the details. We know there's been a decline in provocative acts of attempts to pray on the Temple Mount, but it's very fragile. The Haram Sharif is not a hot spot as it was about 3 months ago. It's very fragile, what's been arranged. Visits are more regularized now. Groups of Israeli Jews can come, or Jews in general can come, to the number of 60 people per day in groups of 15, 3 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. And I've heard that actually they don't get that numbers. Sometimes they don't. Many of them come early in the morning, because they want to avoid the Murabita. So you maybe get 30 people coming in the morning to try and join the group of 15, so they have to wait. And it's a little bit chaotic. They don't fill up all their slots, but roughly it's been capped at 60. There is a little bit of confusion about the 60 because sometimes people wearing kippas in tourist groups are counted, sometimes they're not. It's not always sure how to count them, but that's part of the regularizing of the situation. So there's a cap there. There's much greater cooperation between the Israeli police and the WAP. There's notification of the times that these groups are coming and the nature of the Jewish visits. I understand that the al-Kaf, if they have good reason, can alter the times, ask for them to be changed, can alter the dates of particular groups because it might coincide with something sensitive time at another point. And the al-Kaf can recommend that some people are not allowed to enter. Whether their wishes are always listened to, I don't know. But they have some influence on the individuals who should not enter. In addition to this, there's been a lifting of the restrictions of Muslim male access to the Haram Sharif, and there's a much freer movement now, much freer ability to participate in the life of the Haram Sharif. One result of this is that the Murabitat and Murabitun are much less provocative. They operate in a more distant area. They don't follow the groups around so much in a close, intimidating way that used to cause the tension. And as a result, there are less incidents being reported. One thing that led to a breakthrough was Kerry's adoption of King Abdullah's idea of the installation of cameras, of closed circuit TV cameras to be located in the Haram al-Sharif. However, they have not been installed, and worse than that, I think, or not worse than that, but more importantly, it's very clear that there's been very strong threats that they will be destroyed if they are installed. I understand that King Abdullah invited quite a number of significant people over to Jordan to try to explain and reassure them what the purposes of the cameras were, that they were intended entirely for Jordanian security, and only Jordanian security would have access to them, but he still got the very strong message that this is not acceptable to the Palestinian residents. There is an issue of how to install the cameras. Physically, you have to dig into the ground of the Haram Sharif to install it, and you can imagine what that will do. If you start installing on both sides, there will be problems about how you dig to put the cables to run towards the cameras. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know this at all, but I'm absolutely sure, actually, without having any information, but just from the pattern of security cooperation in the past, the Israelis have a very strong input in the positioning of the cameras, where they will be. I think that's very good. I can't imagine they would allow the cameras to be there without having an input on that. But I have no information. So, why do we have this change between the earlier period where we felt we were moving into this abyss, this crisis, which possibly triggered off the mini intifada that we are experiencing, to a period of transition, of limbo, of we don't quite know what, but there is a change. So how do we explain it? I've got 4 ideas, but they really are speculation, and I would really welcome feedback on them. The first one is, I think King Abdullah made it very clear to Kerry that this was a red line. I can imagine he said to him something like this: I have ISIS on my northern border. If Israel was ISIS on its eastern border, it better stop. because ISIS will bring me down if we lose Jerusalem. I'm sure there was something like that. And I'm sure there's something about the future of the Jordanian regime is crucial to Israeli security, and Israel better not mess with it. And I think Netanyahu got that message. And I'm sure that's the strongest reason why suddenly there was a change in the atmosphere around the praying on the Haram Sharif. There is some suggestions that actually the United States is more concerned about the future of the survival of Jordan than it is about the survival of Israel. Israel can look after itself, but Jordan is actually a closer concern to the United States. There is also a second reason, again, this is from hearsay, from talking to people and seeing some YouTube clips and listening to people talk in a discussion forum. But there has been a change in police tactics. Sorry, thanks, I must speak louder. There has been a change in police tactics. And I think this is a clear signal from the Prime Minister's office, the Israeli Prime Minister's office. Well, in the previous period, the police were a little bit unclear what the political direction was. But after the Kerry Abdullah meeting, they got a very much clearer message. Numbers were increased. Much larger numbers of police were seen on the streets, and there was a faster rotation of units. They were given greater freedom to operate. I've seen pictures of border police scaling al-Aqsa and taking position to be there in case something happens. There's very widespread arrests. Many of the Shabab al-Aqsa have been put into prison or incarcerated. So the potential foot soldiers of any resistance have been dealt with. We've seen metal detectors being installed in Tariq al-Wad. Parents have been punished and fined for the activities of their children. There's much better coordination between the police, the Shin Bet, and the municipality. I'm not sure if I'm being too cynical, but I think in the autumn of last year I understood the municipality put on a lot of afternoon activities programs, after school activities programs. And I'm sure this was a way in which to absorb people's energies and activities as trying to keep the kids off the streets. And clearly, as I've indicated, much closer cooperation, or not cooperation, coordination with Al-Kaf and a greater effort to preempt any threats to the Haram al-Sharif, either from the Israeli radical sides or from the Palestinian radicals, preempt them through intelligence gathering much earlier. So that's the second reason I'm speculating. The third reason I know less about, because I haven't been following it, but I think, and it's not so important as the other two, I would say that it would be the banning of the Islamic movements inside Israel as a way in which many of the activists who were arrested did have Israeli ID cards in the past. That's now a problem, and the Israeli identity is not so much of a deterrent or a protection for the Muslim radicals from the northern branch of the Islamic movement. I don't know much more than that, but that's a speculation on my part. And then the final reason I put down here is that I think Israeli politics itself has changed. There's been a shift away from concern about the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif into other areas because of internal Israeli problems. I'll mention that in the next section. So if in your questions you would like to come back to me on those 4 reasons, I'd be very grateful. I'd like to hear your views on that. So, if this is the situation, in crisis to this perhaps a transitional phase that we're having at the moment, and here I've given some possible reasons for it, what does this tell us about the future? Has the Israeli moment passed? The Israeli moment for acquiring the Haram al-Sharif, have they missed it? Has it slipped from their grasp when it was so close? Will it come back? What are the underlying issues around this? Yeah. Well, I'm afraid, a typical academic, I'm saying yes and no. I'm sorry. I'm saying yes because I think there's certainly globally and regionally and locally a strong awareness that this was very close to a catastrophe. That if that had occurred, particularly in the light of what's happening in the deserts of Syria and Iraq, it would have been a catastrophe for trying to resolve the problems in the Middle East. And generally people have said, you cannot let this happen. It has to be negotiated, it has to be part of an agreement. You cannot allow access to be enforced. You can't allow prayers to be imposed in this way. So I think that's a kind of international consensus around that. So yes, the Israeli moment has passed if you look at it in that context. I think also yes, because the greater security cooperation has proved to be effective. It's producing results. Sometimes security cooperation doesn't always produce results, but in this case it seems to be producing some results, at least for the last 2 months. I also think some Israeli groups were aware that force was not getting them what they wanted. They were pushing and pushing, they were mobilizing, but they were probably at the outer extent of their capacity. They were probably not able to do much more than they were doing, and it was actually creating a very strong counter-reaction internationally and amongst the Palestinians who were seeing themselves as the last barricade before the loss of Jerusalem. And in addition, I think, why I say yes, I do believe the Israeli government blinked. It stirred and it blinked because really there was nothing to stop them. Physically, Iraq is out of the question militarily, Egypt is out of the question militarily, Syria is out of the question militarily, Jordan is an ally. There's nothing to stop the Israelis doing what they want if they chose to do it militarily. And here was the chance, and they blinked. And they blinked because of the earlier issues I mentioned. So I think in some sense it's yes, this opportunity has passed. Right. Why do I say no?
No, you could.
Well, if you look at the current arrangements, they are actually very weak. They're institutionally weak. There is a long precedent for them, but the current ones are verbal, are ad hoc, they are not codified. There's not a document that is substantial. There's no details in the arrangements. And for example, a couple of months ago I conducted a study looking at all the different peace proposals since 1993 and before, right through to Annapolis conference, drawing out the elements that concerned the Haram al-Sharif. What proposals were on the table, looking at security, administration, governance, maintenance, archaeological excavations, trying to see if there was a pattern. Was there some changes? Were there some things was there a thread that ran through all the proposals? And in essence, I came to the conclusion that most of the proposals that seem to be going somewhere, have some substance, were based on 4 things. One, a recognition that with some adjustments, the Clinton parameters would be the basis of an agreement, that there would be Palestinian sovereignty over the Haram Sharif, but with Jewish access to it. There would be a recognition of Jewish heritage and legacy in some form or other. And fourthly, there would be some international observers, verification, monitoring, some sort of international presence, whether it be a weak version along the lines of a UNESCO arrangement, or a stronger version on the lines of some sort of external police force. But there'll be some sort of form of international presence. The current arrangements have nothing like this. The current arrangements are simply a verbal understanding that the previous status quo agreement, the things that sort of lasted until roughly 2010, or actually it's hard to say when, but from 67 right through to the late 90s, early 2000s, that kind of a modus vivendi or modus operandi between the Al-Kaf Palestinians and the Israelis, that would be how things would carry on in the current phase. But it's not codified, it's not written down, it's not based on any law or treaty that has any substance, detailed substance. So what we have really is a series of a short-term interim arrangement, which is contingent on contingent on politics on both sides. And this is perhaps a controversial thing to say, but I'll say it because that's my job, I suppose. Is I'm not always sure it's in the Palestinian interests for the situation to calm down when it comes to the Haram Sharif. Conflict management is usually in the interest of people who are in charge, who are at the top, who are controlling the situation. In a situation where your rights are being eroded, having conflict managed is a way in which you are forced to become complicit, to cooperate in that inequality. So there's a sense in which, without a strong agreement with details about it, the lack of parity, the lack of equality in the agreement I think will lead to a situation where the Palestinians feel that there'll be some advantage if the contest over the Haram Sharif was internationalized in some way. It became an issue, again, because it would draw attention, it would draw support from outside. The other issue, that as a short-term interim agreement, it's not rooted in any international procedures. It's not rooted in the Blue Shield or UNESCO, any of these sort of cultural defense of cultural artifacts which is available in international law. And finally, it's not connected with the wider context of what is happening in Jerusalem. It's like a little bubble separate from other things that are happening, whether it's in the settlements or the land house demolitions or the confiscation of ID cards. It's not connected to those, and there is clearly a connection between them. So, my view really is that this Israel's moment hasn't gone away completely. Israel's potential for an Israeli moment to acquire the Haram Sharif again will arise, because I do not think that the structures we have in place are sufficiently strong to stop it once, to stop that possibility occurring once again. Thank you.